Since we're between snowstorms right now, there's there's been snow on the ground for over 2 weeks. Today's a perfect day to talk about icy winters on the Chesapeake Bay. Welcome to the speaker series offered by the Historical Society of Harford County. I'm Jackie Seneschal, your host for this episode. If you'll be sure to click the subscribe button, you'll be notified of all of our future offerings as well. Today's guest is Jim Foster. He's written a book, Icy Winters on the Chesapeake, chronicling the winters on the Chesapeake, when they occurred and why, and how we survived even under the coldest conditions. Jim first became interested in icy winters on the Chesapeake Bay while working at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. In the 1970s, he had the opportunity to study satellite images of the bay during the intensely cold winters of 1976 and 77. He's written several scientific articles that deal with ice and snow in the Chesapeake Bay region, and this book, Icy Winters on the Chesapeake, is his first general published book. He resides in Colesville, Maryland. Jim, let's get started.
Well, thank you, Jackie, and thank you very much for the Harford County Historical Society for inviting me here this afternoon. As Jackie mentioned, the book chronicles the iciest and coldest winters on the Chesapeake Bay over the last 400 years, since the arrival of the first colonist. Today, I'm going to focus on the upper Chesapeake Bay and ice in the lower Susquehanna Valley. So here's an overview of first, why ice? Why am I going to talk about ice and not snow, for example? The geography of the Chesapeake Bay, early American winters, the Great Ice Railroad across the Susquehanna River, ice gorges along the banks of the Susquehanna River, big ice in the early 1900s, the winter of 1976, 1977, and the early 2000s and beyond. So why ice and not snow? Well, for one thing, there's already been a lot of work that's documented the major snowstorms that have affected the Chesapeake Bay region, but not so much ice. Very little has been written about ice in the Chesapeake Bay. And after all, it's ice that impedes the flow of goods on the Chesapeake Bay. We'll see a little bit later that when the bay is seized up with ice, all commerce stops. So the first slide I'm going to show is actually a snow slide. This is a satellite view of a storm that occurred 3 years ago, January 6th of 2022. It was the last major snowstorm we had before the storm 10 days ago. Snow acts to enhance certain physiological features such as drainage basins, and that's why what I'm showing here to get you oriented. The mouth of the Chesapeake Bay is here. Potomac River is here. This is the main stem of the bay. Baltimore Harbor is in here. Susquehanna River is up in this region here. And over here is the Delaware Bay. So the Chesapeake is about 200 miles in length from Havre de Grace down to Virginia Beach. It's about 30 miles wide at its widest, but overall it's a shallow bay, only averaging about 20 feet in depth. It's the largest estuary in the US, the third largest in the world. And most of the fresh water entering the bay system comes from the Susquehanna, about 50%, and about 25% from the Potomac River. So because of its more northerly position, the upper bay, of course, freezes first. Takes industrial strength cold to freeze the lower bay, not only because it's positioned further south, because it's much saltier and seawater has a lower freezing point. But you can see, looking at this image, this happened to be the first snowstorm of the year in 2022. So the swath of snow cover is easy to see. The sweet spot for this storm was right in the middle of the swath. So Prince Frederick over in the Eastern Shore, Easton and Dover picked up over a foot of snow during the storm. But you can see that places such as York, Philadelphia, even Hagerstown didn't receive any snow at all. Such are the vagaries of winter weather in the Chesapeake Bay region. But if we had snow every year, and if the bay was ice covered every year, the years when it was ice covered wouldn't be so interesting, so conversational. This map shows the drainage basin or the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay region. The dark area is the outline of the watershed. The headwaters of the Chesapeake, of course, is up southern New York. Chesapeake Bay makes up, or the drainage basin comprises states from New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and Delaware. You can see that almost all of Maryland is drained by the Susquehanna River, Chesapeake Bay drainage basin system, which is the 16th largest in the US, and it's the largest east of the Appalachian Mountains. Some 10 to 15,000 years ago, the glaciers in present-day New York and Pennsylvania began to melt, flooding the Susquehanna River. Thousands of years later, hundreds of years later, rather, the lower portion of the Susquehanna River Valley was flooded, forming the Chesapeake Bay region. Chesapeake Bay region is home to some 3,500 species of fish, marine life, animals, plants, and some 18 million people call the Chesapeake Bay region their home, 10 million of which are about an hour's drive from the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see keeping the bay clean and an enjoyable resource for all is indeed quite challenging. So this is a map of the Chesapeake Bay that was made by Augustine Herman in 1670. The orientation is a little bit different here. So the Susquehanna is coming in from the north in this direction. This is the main stem of the bay. Potomac is over here. And this is the eastern shore. For any of you who've driven down the eastern shore, Route 213, the name Augustine Herman may be a bit more familiar. But it's amazing how accurate this map is when you think of how little the cartographers had to work with 400 years ago. One of the main differences you'll see between maps of today and maps in the 1600s is that there's many more islands. There were many more islands in the bay 400 years ago. Thanks to global sea level rise and subsidence of the land around the Chesapeake Bay, many of the islands have disappeared or are in the process of disappearing. So 400 years ago, the arrival of the first colonists, they arrived in Maryland and Virginia for a variety of reasons. Religious freedom, of course, political persecution. There were episodes of plague. Plague is a bacterium, unlike COVID, which is a virus. Weather was grim, crops failed, and famine was widespread. For many Europeans, it was time to leave Mother Europe. And for the more adventurous, the place to go were the colonies. And by moving towards Maryland and Virginia, moving more equatorward, it was thought that the climate would be warmer. Well, it was warmer during the summer, but it was even colder in the winter months. 400 years ago, the effects of the Gulf Stream and Atlantic Ocean on modifying the temperatures in Europe were not well understood. This is a painting in 1625 by one of the Dutch masters, Heinrich Overkamp. It shows the canal scene not too far from current day Amsterdam. From about 1525 to 50 was known as the Little Ice Age. It wasn't cold every winter, but it was much colder just during this period than the period before and the winter after. Certainly much colder than it is now. Glaciers were not advancing from the North Pole or the South Pole, but mountain glaciers did advance across the Alps in Europe. Another painting by one of the Dutch masters, this time Adrian van der Velde, in 1672, I believe is the date. You can see here to the lower right, well-heeled are playing a game that seems to be a combination of golf and hockey. Even a pooch has made it into the scene here. But off the left side of the picture, the working class poor are plying their trade, maybe hoping to earn a guilding or two by selling a pint of grog to these gentlemen after their match. So paintings such as this depicting the ice on the canals in Holland or surrogates or proxies for what was witnessed way back then. We don't have comparable paintings from the colonial period in America, but we do have words from diaries and from journals, such as a journal entry from John Winthrop, who was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. During the bitter cold winter of 1645-46, exchanged letters with an acquaintance, and it was mentioned that ships were frozen up to 6 weeks in Virginia's waters. Thomas Gorges, the proprietary governor of Maine, in writing to his uncle in England, noted, "You must look upon us as prisoners." By us, he meant all the colonists, as prisoners from the end of November, which is the month of September, to the beginning of April. Life was indeed hard in the Americas in the 1600s, especially during the winter season. Moving ahead to the 1700s, I think most of us are familiar with this painting by Emanuel Lutz, showing Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day night in 1776. 1777 was a cold winter, but actually it was not severely cold. Certainly the Washington and his troops, the Continental Army, had to endure a number of deprivations, but 1776, 1777, it was not severely cold. And it's unlikely that Washington would choose to cross the Delaware when the river was ice choked. The last thing a naval officer wants to do is have his boats locked up in ice and be a sitting duck for the enemy. In fact, during most of the Revolutionary War, certainly during the winter months, the English kept their fleets anchored in the warm waters off of Bermuda. So it wasn't bitterly cold in the late 1770s, but there were two occasions in the 1780s and 1780, and again in 1783-84, was known that the bay was frozen from top to bottom. Here's a snippet of correspondence between a new store owner in Baltimore, Henry Johnson, and a business associate in Europe. And he mentions trade is at the present dull, owing to our trade by water being stopped in consequence of the rivers being froze up, which is our greatest support. Our trade by land being trifling to the other. Later during the winter, Mr. Johnson was a bit more circumspect, saying, "I have no news to communicate to you except the scarcity of cash, which is terrible." A few weeks later, in March, he penned, "I have to say, you are a hell of a fellow for swearing. Haven't I written to you at every post that there is no business doing in Baltimore?" When the Chesapeake Bay was frozen up, all commerce stopped, and the flow of cash stopped as well. This is an illustration made by Francis Schill in 1852 as an ad for the Adams Express Company, which is headquartered in Baltimore. It depicts the Great Ice Railroad across the Susquehanna in 1852. In the early 1830s, with the advent of the steam locomotive, railroads could move passengers and goods across solid ground. They couldn't compete with the volume that ships could hold, but they could move freight much more expeditiously. A problem arose when these railroads approached a large body of water, such as the mouth of the Susquehanna River, which is nearly a mile wide between Perryville and Havre de Grace. Most of the time, what would happen? Once the train reached the eastern shore at Perryville, the goods would be transferred onto a ferry. The ferry would move the goods to the western shore to Havre de Grace, where everything would be loaded onto another train and a locomotive facing in a different direction, and off they go. The system worked fine, except when the ice was present in the Susquehanna River and the ferries couldn't operate, such as during the winter of 1852. That time, a fledgling railroad company, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, was trying to make a go of it, but passengers and freight were piled up on each side of the river. This could bring financial ruin to the fledgling Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. So an enterprising chief engineer of the company, Isaac Trimble, decided to lay tracks across the ice. He did so using the tram system, see here down towards the bottom, where cars were lowered onto the ice, onto the tracks, and pulled across the Susquehanna by means of a cable system, sometimes with the assist of mules. Passengers were given sleigh rides with horse-drawn sleds across the Susquehanna River. Because ice often piled up in great heaps as it approached the Chesapeake Bay in the mouth of the Susquehanna River, it was thought that it might be best to curve the track around these great heaps of ice rather than excavate between the ice between Perryville and Havre de Grace. This made the transit a little bit longer, but by curving the ice, it actually made the track more stable. So if the river was to suddenly surge, the track would be less likely to separate. So the track first opened during, I think it was January 15 or 16 in 1852. It shut down about February 23 of 52. And during that time, some 2,400 train cars were moved across the Susquehanna River, equaling about 10,000 tons of freight. Not one single pound was lost, nor was one passenger or crew member injured. That would be a phenomenal feat, even across solid ground, much less a frozen river. But this was the one and only ice railroad across the Susquehanna. A few years later, actually in 1866, the first railroad bridge connecting Perryville and Havre de Grace opened up. And so the ice railroad was no longer needed. Not all years did ice on the Susquehanna behave as well as it did in 1852, nor was it as predictable. In some years, freshets or ice gorges would wreak havoc along either shore of the Susquehanna River, terrifying townspeople, communities on both the eastern shore and the western shore of the Susquehanna River. This is a shot in the late 1800s, the town of Lapidum, which is near the headwaters, which is near the navigable, most navigable point in the Susquehanna River, off of just the eastern portion of Harford County. So these gorges would occur whenever ice filled the Susquehanna River, and then there was a major thaw upstream. All the meltwater, snow and melting ice would rush into the main stem of the Susquehanna, eventually make its way down towards the mouth of the Chesapeake. If the Chesapeake Bay was frozen up, this ice would have nowhere to go except to be expelled sideways onto either shore, devastating everything in its path. This is another view of Nice Gorge in the town of Lapidum. On the other side of the Susquehanna River is Port Deposit. Port Deposit was a thriving community at the time, a center for quarrying, both granite and slate from outcrops just outside of town, and also as a center for processing lumber. You can see here that the Nice Gorge is devastated everything in its path. Because these ice gorges were widely publicized, not only in local papers, but in papers like the Baltimore Sun and the New York Times, it didn't take long for tourists to show up. And when they did, they were in their Sunday finest, posing on tops of some of these mounds of ice, hoping maybe to get a picture in one of the papers. This is another view of Port Deposit. It's not a very clear photograph, but you can see here to the lower right, folks posing for their pictures, and how much ice is in the center of town. This was an account from one of the teachers who was in Port Deposit in the early 1900s and observed her very first ice gorge. How well I remember the first one I ever saw. It was a Sunday morning, warm for winter. I was in the Presbyterian church. During the service, strange sounds came from time to time from the outside, grinding, swishing, and then a roar. And someone shouted. Within the church, no one waited for the benediction, but all made haste for the doors. As we looked out the front windows, we saw a raging, swirling field of ice already risen to the level of the churchyard, which was some 5 to 6 feet above the sidewalk. We got out the back way, climbed the cliff, and so got home. I shall never forget the view of the river from the heights above. Could that raging devilish monster be the lovely Susquehanna on which I had so many delightful sails? Well, indeed it was. And what a mess it was trying to clean up the aftermath of these ice gorges. Certainly an arduous task for the workers, but the ice had to be cleared. It would take weeks, if not a month or two, to melt this ice, which had the consistency of cement. And so the only way to get supplies in and out of town was to clear the track. So with the construction of the Conowingo Dam in the 1920s, the frequency of these ice gorges was drastically reduced. On occasion, however, they still occur, such as in 1996. This is a gorge that derailed a train just upstream from the Conowingo Dam. If you remember 1996, in early January of that year, there's 2 feet of snow in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Harrisburg, almost everywhere in Pennsylvania and Maryland, there was an abundance of snow. Mid-January of 1996, all of that snow began to melt. And within a 5-day period, a good portion of it was gone. Most of it making its way into the Susquehanna River, where again, it funneled down towards the Chesapeake Bay. Even the Conowingo Dam couldn't hold all the ice and water, so some of it had to be released. And once again, Port Deposit was damaged by an ice gorge. Fortunately, nowhere near as bad it was 100 years before. So now we're moving into the 20th century. This is the first ice. 1917, 1918 was the first epic winter of the 20th century, when the bay was known to be frozen from stem to stern. This photograph is actually taken off Virginia Beach. It's curious how folks, whenever you see a body of water that's frozen for the first time, it's just human nature that we seem to want to explore it. But for the watermen, it was time to go to work. At the time, there was no such thing as workmen's compensation or unemployment. So the watermen knew they had to get their tongs and go to work, cut a hole in the ice and bring up the oysters. Some were a little bit more creative or maybe riskier than others. And you can see here, they brought up quite a haul on this day. Folger McKenzie, also known as the Benstown Bard, was a columnist for the Baltimore Sun in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. He'd often write about the Chesapeake Bay, and during the winter months, if ice was seen in the Chesapeake Bay, he'd spin a yarn or sometimes even write a poem. This is this poem, Ice on the Chesapeake Bay. I'll just read a couple of verses. From Turkey Point to the outbound capes and back again to town, the bay ice swept in crystal shapes with the white snow for a crown. From Sassafras and the Pocomoke, from the Elk to Walnut Cove, no shipping there on the long white trail, no stream and not a sail. Lost ducks sitting along the shore, and the channel light so low, and no ship in Baltimore since 3 long weeks ago. This was penned in 1934, another bitter cold winter in the Chesapeake Bay during the middle of the Depression. If the ships weren't getting into harbor, there was no work. And particularly during the Depression, life was hard. Moving on to the winter of 1976, 1977, this is the second epic freeze of the Chesapeake Bay in the 20th century. You're taken off of Sandy Point. You can see the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in the background. You have a sense for that this was taken in the 1970s just by the apparel that some of the people wearing bell-bottom pants. Some of the skaters or walkers in jeans. Maybe if you look closely, you might even see a gent in a leisure suit. Anyway, they're walking across the ice here. Some have ventured out several hundred yards. It's reported that some folks would cross the bay and back again. So frozen, so solidly frozen was the Chesapeake Bay during the winter of 76, 77. By the mid-70s, we had satellite imagery looking at the Chesapeake. This is an image of the Landsat satellite. It was acquired in mid-January of 1977 to get you familiarized. Again, this is the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay. This is the mouth of the Potomac River, Patuxent River. Up here is Baltimore Harbor is up in this vicinity here. In the northern part of the bay, where the ice is covered with snow, so that's why it appears white. Blue ice in this vicinity here is expanses of ice that have yet to be covered by snow. This is just a couple weeks later. Again, with the Landsat satellite, I believe the date is February 1, 1977. You can see that now the ice extends all the way towards the Virginia Capes. Again, this is the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay right here. But all this ice was compressed on the eastern shore because in late January, strong winds were compressing the ice against the eastern shore. But it didn't take long once the winds abated for this water to refreeze in a day or two. So nearly the entire bay was frozen from top to bottom. I'll bring your attention to this area just south of Kent Island. This is the inlet. Miles River is this vicinity. Here you can see where it's frozen up, completely frozen in this area. And in 1977, the National Ice Boat Championships were actually held in the inlet of Miles River. Who even knew that there was such a thing as the National Ice Boat Championships? Well, it just so happened that the ice in the middle portion of the Chesapeake Bay was ideal for ice boat racing. Here's one of the ice boats here in the foreground, and one in the background. Here's one with sails deployed. They're outfitted with a rig that had two ice blades on either side and one up front. The idea was that you run heats with the wind and back into the wind that were approximately a mile in length. These heats were run for 2 days until the winning boats until it was decided which boats were the fastest and prizes were awarded. But the Miles River was completely frozen, no ridges, no cracks in the ice. There was, because the ice at this time wasn't snow covered, it wasn't lumpy, so it was smooth as glass and really ideal conditions for these ice boats. And this is the only time that the ice boats raced national competition in the Chesapeake Bay. You can see it's not a very friendly spectator sport. People here in the foreground don't look too happy. State of Maryland Department of Natural Resources has 4 or 5 tugboats that they'll bring out on the iciest winter to open up channels. You can see the ice in 1977 was a little bit too much for Big Lou. The crew fortunately was able to abandon ship. I understand actually Big Lou is still operating today. In order to open up the Baltimore Harbor and the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, and in fact to bring goods such as heating oil into communities on Smith Island and Tangier Island, the Coast Guard cutters had to be brought in. Here's an aerial view of one of the cutters. This looks really not much different from the Arctic Ocean. In the winter of 1917-18, at the end of the First World War, battleships were used to break up the ice going into Baltimore Harbor. Once the channel was opened up, the old salts here, the watermen were quick to take advantage of it. You can see this gentleman on his boat, the Gypsy Girl, tongs ready to dip into this opened channel. But the watermen had to be very careful. The boats really were their life work, and you get your boat frozen up. They lose your boat, you lose their livelihood. During the winter of 76, 77, hundreds, if not thousands, of piers and docks were ruined by the ice, which would lift the pilings out of the water, or the wind would crash the ice against the pilings and thrash them about, as shown here. Even the Sharp Island Lighthouse was knocked a-kilter by the ice in 1977. It still looks like that today. No longer operates, but it's there as a reminder of Maryland's little Tower of Pisa. There was still cash at the bottom of the bay, even though it was frozen up. It was time for the watermen to get to work. You can see that this waterman is making his way out of a hole cut in the ice. He's wearing some sort of a diving suit of some sort. It looks like his life support system. It's not much more than a kite string that his friend is working here. Man, it does not look very inviting. But again, you can see in this case, the reward was worth the risk. They had quite a haul on this winter's day. Just about any time there was ice in the rivers feeding the bay and in the bay itself, there was an opportunity for guys to be knuckleheads, such as here when the mouth of the Patuxent River where it entered the bay. a delivery man decided that he could take a shortcut, didn't really need to use the bridge in the background. Fortunately, this case and a lot of other cases, the pride was hurt more than anything else. So why was it so cold during the winter of 76, 77 and the winter of 1917, 1918? Well, this is a upper air map showing the atmospheric flow during the winter, January of 1977. This low pressure system is referred to as a trough. It was a semi-permanent feature during the winter of 1976-77. So winds would move counterclockwise around this trough. These lines are equal lines of equal pressure, isobars. So you can see that the temperature or the pressure differences between northern Canada and say southern Georgia, northern Florida, very similar. This cold air was funneled from north to south weeks at a time. Sure, there was some moderation as the air moved from Canada into the mid-Atlantic region, but still it was bitter cold. Where the isobars are closest, this is the jet stream. Here it's moving off into the Atlantic. Storm tracks forms along the jet stream. You can see during the winter of 1977, the storm track was well out to sea. And indeed, 1977 in the Chesapeake Bay region was not very snowy. Bitter cold, but not very snowy. And some years, there's just not much correlation between how cold it is and how much snow is received. One place it was snowy was actually in Florida, though. For the first and the only time, Miami, Florida recorded snowfall during January of 1977. So what are the ingredients for the epic winters in the Chesapeake Bay when the bay is frozen from top to bottom? Well, you have to have prolonged cold, not just an occasional push of cold, but bouts of cold that last for weeks at a time. Additionally, there has to be a continuous northerly flow in the upper atmosphere. This is the so-called polar express that we've been hearing about this winter, and also referred to as the Siberian Express, polar vortex, or the Siberian Express. One other thing, there could be few big storms. The storms tend to retard the bay's freezing. And also, if the storms in vicinity of the bay will suck in warm air from the Gulf Stream and make it harder for the bay's water to freeze up. One more requirement is a cold autumn, or at least chilly autumn, so that the bay waters, pre-cooled when the first blasts of icy air arrive during the winter season. Water has a high thermal inertia, so it takes a lot of energy to lower its temperature 1 degree or raise it 1 degree, much more energy than it does to raise or lower the temperature of air by 1 degree. So we have had winters where the ice has been prevalent in the bay since 1977 and the early 1980s, for example, and the early 2000s. But the last time we had a lot of ice in the bay was the winter of 2014, 2015. This is another satellite image. This time it was acquired in February of 2015. Look how much ice is here in the Delaware Bay, and you can see ice in the upper Chesapeake Bay into the middle regions of the Chesapeake Bay as well. And there's quite a bit of ice in the inlets of the lower bay and in the Potomac River. This chart shows water temperature in Baltimore during winter of 14, winter of 15. You can see the water temperature starts out, and water temperature here is pretty normal. As winter moves along, the temperature drops, but it wasn't until early February to mid-February, where the cold temperatures really set in and the water temperature dropped precipitously. This image, satellite image, was acquired on March 10, 2015. You can see now that the ice has melted in Delaware Bay, but there's still a lot of ice in the Chesapeake Bay in the vicinity of the Bay Bridge, also in the northern part of the Chesapeake Bay and in some of its tributaries, such as in the Rappahannock River. Keep in mind, this image was taken on March 10, just 11 days from the equinox. So one of the differences between the winter of 2015 and the winter of 1977 is that the winter of 2015 was late arriving. By early March in 1977, nearly all the ice had already melted in the Chesapeake Bay. But in 2015, ice was still a concern for navigation. In fact, tugboats had to be brought in even into mid-March to clear channels in Baltimore. This is shows skyline of Baltimore in the background, and also to keep the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal open. One more painting, this time by Guy Steele Fairchild. This is showing the frozen C&O Canal, not too far from Great Falls. In the background here is the Tavern Visitor Center, familiar landmark. You can see how a flash of color will brighten up an otherwise grim winter's day. One other thing to notice is that now pooch has made its way into the foreground. This chart shows mean winter temperatures for Maryland from the late 1800s to the early 2000s. This solid line here and the blue line about it is the trend line. So it's quite evident that the temperatures have become warmer over the last 125 years or so. Nonetheless, there's still years when the Bay vicinity gets very cold enough to freeze up. This chart only goes to 2014. 2015, the winter temperature would have been just in about this vicinity here. So this plot shows the winter temperatures, the water temperature at Turkey Point during 2024. Red line is temperature in 2024. The blue solid line is the mean temperature between 1985 and 2022. You can see how anomalously warm the water temperature was last winter, and it was warm all through the winter until in early August, when all that rain from Tropical Storm Debbie made its way into the Chesapeake Bay, and the water temperature began to drop a little bit below the norm. But by mid-autumn to late autumn, the water temperatures were much warmer again, certainly much warmer than in 1977. So it's very unlikely that even though it's been very cold this January, 5 degrees colder than normal, 9 degrees colder than last year, still though, it's been 6 degrees warmer than January of 1977. So this is unlikely to be a winter when ice makes its way all the way past the Potomac River towards the Virginia Capes. This is a plot of the epic ice years in the Chesapeake Bay over the last 400 years, years where we know the bay was frozen up at least 2 weeks of the time the bay was frozen from top to bottom. Now we know it was colder in the 1600s and the 1700s than in current times, but not in every year was it cold did the bay completely freeze from top to bottom. Between 1918 and 1977, when we had the last epic freeze, it's a period of 59 years, and now it's already been 48 years since 1977. So with a warming climate, is a completely frozen Chesapeake Bay a thing of the past? Well, I would be surprised if by the end of this century, there wasn't at least 1 year where the bay were to be nearly completely frozen again. Well, we might have an autumn where the temperatures were very chilly, and during early winter, the polar express would be positioned north of the Chesapeake Bay in southern Canada, and pulse after pulse of cold air would funnel into the Chesapeake Bay region. Storm track would be well off the coast, and again, the Chesapeake Bay would begin to freeze up. And people would pose on ice floes in the Chesapeake Bay, which is such as here off of Cove Point Lighthouse near the Tucson River, pose to have their family pictures taken. And I'll close with this quote: "How many lessons of faith and beauty we should lose if there were no winter in our year." Well, thank you for tuning in. And if there are any questions, I'll try my best to answer them.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, not only of the winters that the bay has frozen over, but also those dates when, but an explanation from a scientific perspective about why it happened and how it happened. That was absolutely fascinating, and I appreciate it. For those of you who are listening, first of all, I want to acknowledge Mark Magnus and Common Ground Earth, who provided us technical assistance with this recording. Excuse me. As well as Bill Walden and Steve Oliver from Main Street Design, who help with every one of our recordings. If you liked this episode, please press like. Be sure to subscribe so that you'll be notified the next time we have an episode. If you'd like to become a member of the Historical Society, we invite you to do so at www.harfordhistory.org. Thank you, and have a great winter.